The wind off the Baltic carried the scent of rust and salt when divers first touched the steel hatch beneath Lake Vättern. Their lights cut through decades of silt, revealing the faded insignia of an eagle clutching a broken swastika, a mark unseen since the war. As the hatch groaned open, a rush of air escaped, stale and heavy with chemical decay. Inside, the walls were lined with instruments stamped in German, their dials frozen mid-measurement. What began as a routine survey of a submerged site soon became something else. The rediscovery of a Nazi facility thought to be legend, a place whispered about in wartime intelligence as Project Norsken. The lake had kept its secret for nearly 80 years, until now. Chapter 1. The Bunker. Beneath Lake Vättern. Before the war, Sweden stood at a crossroads, a nation of neutrality surrounded by chaos. Its forests, deep and ancient, hid more than wildlife. They held the attention of both warring sides. The Baltic shimmered cold and deceptive, a mirror reflecting peace that barely held. Beneath it, whispers of secret shipments and quiet meetings between diplomats and officers passed from port to port. The year was 1939, and Europe trembled. Across the continent, Germany moved with a precision that frightened even its allies. The Reich sought iron, ore, and access, resources that Sweden possessed in abundance. Trains carrying steel rumbled through Scandinavian night, their tracks glistening under frost. Officially, trade was neutral. In reality, it was survival. Every government file, every coded message from that time, spoke of balance, neutrality bought with silence. But in the shadow of Stockholm's ministries, men in plain suits and polished shoes held meetings off the record. British envoys, German officers, Swedish industrialists, each playing a quiet hand in the greater game. Somewhere between the northern mines and the southern harbours, an agreement was struck. A small group of German scientists, travelling under diplomatic cover, would establish a remote meteorological research station on Swedish soil. It was, on paper, a harmless exchange of scientific cooperation. Off paper, it was something else. The locals near Lake Vättern began noticing strange movements at night. Convoys of trucks under blackout curtains, guards who spoke broken Swedish but carried weapons none had seen before. Fishermen were warned to avoid a particular inlet. Officially, it was for naval testing. Unofficially, it was sealed off. That inlet would become the mouth of what engineers would call Tunnel A1, the access point to a subterranean structure carved directly into the bedrock beneath the lake. The year turned to 1940, and war swept across Europe like a storm. Norway fell, Denmark surrendered, and still Sweden held its fragile neutrality. But neutrality in times like these was never pure. Swedish engineers, pressured by quiet deals, began delivering components designed for research use. Some were electrical coils, others optical assemblies, too advanced, too expensive for weather studies. The truth was hidden under the polite language of bureaucracy. In the German archives, fragments of communication remain. References to Lichtsturm, light storm, a field experiment in electromagnetic resonance. A document dated June 1942, signed by an SS Oberst named Reinhard Kiesel, lists the site under the classification Nordlicht Initiative, tied to experimental weaponry research. Whether the Swedish government knew the full extent of it remains debated. What's certain is that shipments of specialized metal alloys and radio components were smuggled through neutral ports all through that year. Meanwhile, across the world, the war turned darker. The Allied forces fought tooth and nail across North Africa and the Atlantic. Scientists from London to Los Alamos were racing toward discoveries that could end or redefine warfare. It was an age of desperation disguised as progress, and under Lake Vättern, that desperation took form in steel and concrete. By 1943, the bunker was fully operational. Codenamed Project Norsken, it was staffed by a team of 37 personnel, scientists, engineers, and guards. Its purpose, to harness high-frequency electromagnetic fields as a potential countermeasure to Allied radar. In theory, it could disrupt detection systems, rendering aircraft and naval movements invisible. In practice, it was unstable, unpredictable, and deadly. Test chambers built inside the cavern hummed with invisible energy that warped compasses and blackened film reels. The experiments demanded power, far more than the region could supply. So, a separate cable was laid under the lake, disguised as part of a hydroelectric project. Locals who questioned the construction were dismissed or relocated. A fisherman named Lars Nyström later wrote in his diary, "The water glows at night near the ridge. They say it's the moon, but I've seen the moon, and it doesn't hum." By 1944, Allied intelligence had begun intercepting fragments of radio chatter, bursts of encrypted transmission emanating from Sweden's heartland. British codebreakers traced them, but could not confirm origin. Reports reached the OSS describing a hidden facility under Scandinavian jurisdiction possibly assisting Axis research. Diplomatic caution buried the findings. No one dared to accuse a neutral nation outright. And then, silence. In late 1945, after the Reich collapsed, the transmissions stopped. The personnel stationed near Vättern vanished. Officially, the bunker was never acknowledged. Unofficially, rumors spoke of an evacuation gone wrong, of equipment dismantled, flooded chambers, and sealed tunnels. Sweden's neutrality once again held. For decades, fishermen told stories of strange sonar echoes and magnetic anomalies. Divers avoided the depths. Government agencies denied any construction ever existed. But deep in classified archives, both Allied and Soviet, the name Norsken appeared, redacted, under post-war recovery interests. Something valuable had been lost under that lake. Something neither side dared to retrieve. Time passed. The war faded into textbooks. Generations were born, lived, and died with no knowledge of what slept beneath the frozen waters. Until, in 2022, a sonar survey team, mapping for civilian purposes, stumbled upon a geometric structure beneath the sediment. Steel, angular, impossible for nature to create. The site was reported quietly to the Swedish Defense Agency. Within weeks, men in unmarked vehicles arrived and sealed off the area. But word had already spread. Whispers on online forums, photographs leaked by divers before they were confiscated. That was the beginning. The rediscovery of a forgotten chapter in the machinery of war, a secret built on neutrality, powered by fear, and buried under a lake that refused to give up its ghosts. Chapter 2. Operation Glass Veil, the East Berlin Tapes. The war ended, but its silence was heavy. Too heavy. The world was divided not by oceans but by ideology. East against West. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe like a blade, slicing families, cities, and histories in half. Berlin, once a symbol of culture and resilience, became a fractured organism. Its heart still beat, but each side claimed a different rhythm. In the rubble of the Reich, both victors sought what had been left behind: scientists, technologies, data. The Americans called it Operation Paperclip. The Soviets had their own version, far more ruthless. From the ruins of secret laboratories and collapsed tunnels, they collected men who once served the Reich's science divisions. Men who claimed to know how to alter minds, how to control fear, how to make loyalty something that could be engineered. Some vanished into Soviet institutes, others into American bases that didn't exist on maps. By the early 1950s, East Berlin had become the center of a quiet, invisible conflict, one not fought with tanks or planes but with information. The Stasi was still forming its identity, absorbing techniques from the NKVD and building an apparatus of surveillance so absolute it would make paranoia an institution. Microphones in walls, cameras disguised as clock faces, letters steamed open under dim yellow light. It was the art of control perfected. But within that machinery, something even darker began to take shape. A research program the public would never be allowed to see. They called it Operation Glass Veil. Officially, it was a study in optical cognition, the effect of visual stimuli on the human psyche. Unofficially, it was an experiment in breaking human resistance without physical coercion. In the dim corridors of East Berlin's Institute for Behavioral Sciences, scientists conducted trials on political prisoners, dissidents, captured spies, even their own defectors. They were shown pulsing lights, rhythmic frequencies, and distorted images for hours on end. Their reactions monitored, recorded, and reported. The goal wasn't to torture, it was to erase, to reprogram, to see how far perception could bend before identity shattered. One of the lead researchers, Dr. Erich Bauer, a neurologist once affiliated with wartime experiments in Leipzig, kept a hidden diary. His entries, found decades later in a Stasi archive mislabeled technical correspondence, revealed glimpses of the operation's intent. They believe sight can be used to rewrite memory, he wrote in April 1957. not through hypnosis or suggestion, but through sustained manipulation of neural rhythm. I see no conscience here, only the will to control. Meanwhile, across the wall, the Americans and British were running their own experiments, MKUltra, MK Search, programs that mirrored what Glass Veil sought to achieve. Unbeknownst to the world, the two sides were chasing the same ghost, psychological supremacy. Both believed that the next war would not be fought with bombs, but with the human mind as the battlefield. In 1962, an informant inside the Stasi smuggled several audio reels across the border. Each was marked GV6-62 and contained recorded sessions between senior scientists and their Soviet handlers. The tapes were never broadcast, never officially acknowledged. They were stored in a British vault under the name Acoustic Archive 47. There, they remained sealed for over 60 years until 2024, when a digitization project uncovered them by accident. What analysts heard shocked even seasoned historians. The voices spoke calmly, methodically, about photic trials, receptive collapse, and compliance induction. Phrases that sounded clinical, almost detached, until one voice, female, trembling, broke through. "Please, stop the light." Her words repeated over and over, beneath the hum of equipment and the quiet instructions of her captors. Then silence. That moment, frozen in magnetic tape, became the heart of the rediscovered scandal. For years, East German archives had hinted at missing files, redacted reports, unexplained disappearances from prison records, but never proof. Now, the proof spoke for itself, literally. The investigation that followed stretched across borders. Historians, journalists, and survivors' families pieced together a network of cooperation that neither side of the Cold War had ever admitted to. Documents found in Washington referenced optical exchange assets, while Soviet memos from 1961 mentioned shared data pools with Western counterparts. The implication was staggering. Despite the ideological divide, fragments of Glass Veil research had made their way into Western intelligence, possibly through back channels in divided Berlin. The question wasn't just what they had done, but how much of it had survived. Dr. Bauer's notes described an experiment involving rhythmic strobe exposure paired with recorded vocal patterns. The intended outcome was emotional suppression, the ability to erase trauma responses in agents exposed to combat stress. But prolonged exposure caused neural degradation, hallucinations, and eventually, total psychological collapse. The subject no longer fears, Bauer wrote. He no longer recognizes self. He becomes obedient but not alive. Decades later, neuroscientists reviewing the recovered data recognized early elements of what we now call sensory conditioning. Techniques refined in later years for interrogation, marketing, and even entertainment. The legacy of Glass Veil didn't end in that East Berlin basement. It seeped quietly into the world above, disguised as progress. When the tapes were finally made public, survivors groups in Germany demanded accountability. They wanted names, compensation, truth. But truth in Cold War history is rarely clean. Many of the scientists involved were dead. Others had emigrated, changed identities, or worked under protection from both Eastern and Western intelligence. Governments issued cautious statements, each emphasizing the era's context. The victims received silence. In Berlin today, the Institute building still stands, renovated, its walls freshly painted, its past politely omitted from the plaque outside. But beneath the new floorboards, under the concrete poured during restoration, lie remnants of the old acoustic chambers. When researchers visit, they describe a faint echo that lingers in the air. A low hum, constant, like the whisper of a machine that refuses to power down. And so, Operation Glass Veil remains one of history's quietest crimes. A collaboration denied by all, proven by none, remembered only by the voices trapped on aging magnetic tape, voices that once pleaded through the light, unaware that their suffering would become data, and that data would become legacy. Chapter 3: The Silent Convoy of Murmansk. The Arctic has never been a forgiving place. The wind cuts like glass, the sea never truly still, and the horizon feels endless, a void of white swallowing everything it touches. Yet during the war, that frozen expanse was one of the most critical lifelines of survival. The Arctic convoys, Allied supply routes from Britain to the Soviet Union, carried food, ammunition, and hope through those deadly waters. They sailed in silence, knowing that beneath the ice and behind the clouds the enemy watched. In early 1943, one such convoy left Liverpool under the codename PQ-47. Among its ships was one that did not exist on any registry, the SS Helix. It was a small freighter, plain and unremarkable, its hull painted the dull grey of anonymity. Official manifests listed it as carrying industrial equipment. Unofficially, it carried something far more valuable: a shipment of experimental radar components developed in joint secrecy between British engineers and Soviet scientists. The project was known internally as Frostline. For years, Frostline had been whispered about in naval circles. Its goal was simple but revolutionary: to create a radar interference system capable of cloaking fleets from German U-boats. Early prototypes showed promise, but the technology was volatile. Energy surges, magnetic feedback, and unpredictable radiation made it both dangerous and unreliable. Still, desperate times demanded desperate innovations. The Helix was meant to deliver the equipment to Murmansk, where Soviet specialists would test and replicate it. Only a handful of people knew the ship's true purpose, and fewer still would live to tell its story. The voyage began under a sky of bruised grey, the air thick with the scent of salt and diesel. Sailors huddled in heavy coats, eyes fixed on the horizon. Each night, the aurora danced faintly above, its pale ribbons reflected in the ice. But beauty meant little in those waters. U-boats prowled beneath, and Luftwaffe bombers searched from above. The Arctic did not forgive mistakes. On the fifth night, the convoy was scattered by a storm. Ice tore through hulls, radio lines froze solid, and the men fought to keep engines alive in temperatures that numbed fingers to bone. When the storm cleared, the Helix was gone. Not sunk and just vanished. No flares, no wreckage, no distress signal. The convoy pressed on, its commanders believing she'd been lost to the depths like so many others. But she wasn't gone. Not entirely. In 2023, 80 years later, a Norwegian research vessel mapping the Kola Peninsula's seabed discovered an anomaly. A ship, perfectly preserved under layers of silt and ice, its nameplate still legible: SS Helix. The discovery stunned historians. When divers descended, they found the vessel intact, its cargo holds sealed. Inside were rusted canisters, airtight and stamped with the Allied emblem, and the word "classified" etched in English. The recovered contents defied explanation. Microfilm reels, undamaged, containing schematics of advanced signal interference systems, decades ahead of their time. Diagrams referenced energy patterns consistent with early stealth technology, long before stealth had a name. But most striking were the documents written in both English and Cyrillic. Collaboration, long denied by both sides, now lay cold and undeniable. Historians traced the paper trail and found a string of erased references in British Ministry of Defence records. One entry, dated February 1943, simply read, "Frostline materials transferred under joint directive. Priority black, archive pending." The file ended there. No follow-up, no closure. When word of the Helix discovery reached the Russian military, their response was immediate and quiet. Within a week, the site was classified as a restricted zone. Officially, it was to protect the ecological integrity of the area. Unofficially, recovery operations began under cover of darkness. Satellite images showed vessels anchoring above the wreck, cranes lowering equipment, and unmarked containers airlifted inland. The operation ended just as suddenly as it began. No statements were ever issued. Divers who managed to capture footage before being turned away reported eerie scenes inside the hull. Instruments corroded yet intact. Frozen journals, still legible. One page, found in a sealed captain's log, read, "We were told not to question. We are not meant to reach port. If this is found, forgive us." The entry stopped mid-line. Ink smeared as though by shaking hands. What had truly happened in those final hours? One theory suggests the Helix was deliberately scuttled to prevent her technology from being captured by German forces or by her own allies should politics shift. Another, more haunting, proposes that the ship's experimental power source malfunctioned, creating a surge that crippled her systems and trapped her beneath the ice. The latter would explain the distorted magnetic readings still detected near the wreck today. For the men aboard, the end must have been quiet, engines fading, lights dimming, the temperature dropping as the sea pressed closer. They would have known rescue was impossible. The Arctic gives nothing back. Some say that when the sonar pings today, a faint echo returns, not from the hull, but from deeper within, as if the ship itself still hums, trapped between signal and silence. In both London and Moscow, the discovery of the helix has reopened old wounds. It proves that the Allies and Soviets shared far more technology than official history admits. A partnership buried under decades of Cold War distrust. For intelligence historians, Frostline stands as a rare moment of unity in an age of suspicion. For the families of those lost, it's a reminder that secrets often outlive those who kept them. Standing on the deck of the research vessel, one diver described looking down through the water, seeing the faint outline of the ship resting in darkness. It felt, he said, like she was watching us, like she'd been waiting. The Arctic, indifferent as ever, holds her still, and somewhere inside that silence, in the frozen memory of a forgotten convoy, the ghosts of the helix keep their last watch, guarding the secret they were never meant to deliver. Chapter 4. The Red Vaults of Kyshtym. The Ural Mountains stretch like a spine across the heart of Russia, ancient, scarred, and silent. Beneath their forests and frozen rivers, the Soviets buried many of their secrets. Some were mines, some were bunkers, and some were laboratories that no map ever dared to name. Kyshtym was one of those places, small, remote, and surrounded by fences that kept the curious far away. Officially, it was a chemical production town. Unofficially, it was one of the Soviet Union's most dangerous testing grounds. In 1957, Kyshtym was the site of a disaster so severe it remained hidden from the world for decades. A storage tank at the Mayak nuclear complex exploded, scattering radioactive waste across hundreds of square kilometers. Entire villages disappeared from maps overnight. The Soviet government called it an industrial accident. Survivors called it something else: hell on earth. What few outsiders knew was that the explosion was only part of the story. Deep beneath the complex lay a series of sealed chambers, the so-called Red Vaults, where research far darker than nuclear energy took place. For years, rumors circulated among former technicians. They spoke of bioweapon prototypes, of animal testing gone wrong, of samples marked confidential and stored in lead-lined crates. But the full extent of what lay below was buried under state secrecy until 2021, when a structural collapse at the old site revealed a forgotten tunnel. Workers stumbled upon a rusted door, half crushed by concrete, marked only with a faded serial number, Object 13. The authorities reacted fast. Within hours, the area was sealed and military trucks rolled in. But in the age of satellite imagery and online leaks, secrecy doesn't last long. Images of hazmat teams carrying metal containers began circulating on underground forums. Their markings were unmistakable. The Soviet nuclear symbol, paired with Western labeling in English. It wasn't just Soviet material down there. It was something shared. Archived documents later recovered by investigative journalists hinted at a covert Cold War exchange. In the late 1950s, during the brief thaw of détente, both East and West had pursued biological and radiological research under the guise of defensive studies. The Kyshtym facility had supposedly been one of several locations chosen for controlled experimentation, not just on pathogens, but on the effects of long-term radiation exposure on human biology. Some of the experiments, according to partial records, involved test subjects taken from nearby labor camps. None of them were ever named. Inside the Red Vaults, modern investigators found shattered glass vials, decayed instruments, and chillingly preserved samples. Small, frozen containers labeled in Cyrillic and English. The inscriptions read, Project Silver Ash. Cross-referencing declassified US intelligence from the 1960s revealed a matching term. Operation Silver Ash, a recovery mission that disappeared from all official logs in 1962. Its supposed objective was to acquire lost experimental material from Soviet territory following an undisclosed cooperation breakdown. Until the discovery in 2021, no proof of the operation's existence had ever surfaced. The recovered samples were sent to secure laboratories for analysis. Their contents were never disclosed publicly. Unverified reports from scientists who handled the material described a strange hybrid structure, part biological, part synthetic, as if the Soviets had been trying to engineer resistance to radiation itself. Some of the preserved notes referenced adaptive cellular matrices, suggesting an attempt to create life that could survive nuclear environments. If true, it would have been the earliest known effort in bioradiological adaptation, a concept decades ahead of its time. When these findings reached the press, Moscow dismissed them as Western propaganda. The Russian Ministry of Defense declared the Kyshtym collapse an exaggerated environmental incident. But witnesses told another story. A retired chemical engineer who worked at MIAC in the 1960s, interviewed anonymously, claimed that Object 13 wasn't a single project. It was a repository, a vault where the failures of multiple secret programs were stored away. When something went wrong, he said, they didn't destroy it, they buried it. He described convoys arriving under darkness, escorted by armed guards. Crates offloaded, logged and lowered into the vaults before being sealed behind lead doors. We didn't ask what was inside, he said. We just prayed it stayed there. Decades later, the radiation levels around Kyshtym still remain higher than normal. Locals avoid certain patches of forest where the trees twist unnaturally, their bark blackened from within. The rivers run clear, yet fish vanish overnight. It's as if the land itself remembers what was done there and refuses to heal. For the people living nearby, the rediscovery in 2021 reopened old wounds. Families who lost relatives during the 1957 disaster demanded answers. Activists called for excavation and transparency, but the government responded with silence, fencing off the site once more. The official explanation cited national security concerns. The Red Vaults were reburied, this time under new concrete, thicker, cleaner, colder. Still, fragments of truth escape. Through leaked documents and whispered accounts, the picture becomes clearer. The Cold War's arms race extended far beyond missiles and bombs. It reached into the most sacred fabric of life itself, the human body. In their pursuit of survival, both sides crossed boundaries they could never uncross. Standing in the shadow of the collapsed reactor, one journalist described the scene. It's quiet, but you can feel it. The ground hums, as if the earth remembers. Beneath her feet lay a tomb of science and secrecy, the intersection of progress and horror. Today, Kyshtym is a name few outside Russia recognize. A small town rebuilt over its own scars, its people carrying on as if the past were just another ghost in the snow. But those who know the history understand. The Red Vaults were not an accident. They were a choice. One made by men who believed secrecy was safer than truth. And deep below, sealed once more behind reinforced steel, the legacy of those choices sleeps in silence, waiting perhaps for the next collapse to reveal what humanity tried so hard to forget. Chapter 5. The Manila Transmission. In the humid air of the Philippine archipelago, where the sea hums against rusted piers and the ghosts of empires linger in the palms, one man stumbled upon a relic that would unravel a forgotten strand of Cold War history. It began, as these stories often do, with something small, a trunk, long sealed, discovered in the corner of a cluttered attic. Inside, wrapped in faded canvas, lay a shortwave transceiver, its dial frozen on a single frequency, 13.73 MHz. Alongside it, a leather-bound notebook filled with ciphered coordinates, and the name Operation Shadow Node. The trunk belonged to a man who had served as a communications officer at the US Naval Base in Subic Bay during the early 1950s. He had died decades earlier, his wartime stories reduced to fragments over family dinners. It wasn't until 2025, when his son unearthed the trunk, that those fragments began to form a map. One that pointed to a secret buried in the static of post-war radio transmissions. At the height of the Cold War, the Philippines sat at a crossroads of power. The Americans had turned the islands into a linchpin for their Pacific strategy, a listening post for Soviet communications, a launch point for reconnaissance flights over Asia. Officially, these bases served defensive purposes. Unofficially, they were part of an invisible network of signal interception known as Shadow Node. Shadow Node's purpose was simple: intercept, mimic, and redirect Soviet transmissions across the Pacific theater. Its operators, a blend of American intelligence officers and Filipino technicians, manned radio towers camouflaged as civilian stations. The operation was as secret as it was illegal, conducted without the full knowledge of the Philippine government. Every night, beneath the chorus of crickets and the crackle of the tropic air, encrypted bursts of Morse code leapt between islands like whispers in the dark. The notebook recovered from the trunk contained a grid of coordinates, each one corresponding to a defunct radio tower across Luzon, Palawan, and Mindanao. When modern historians cross-reference those coordinates with declassified US Navy maps, they aligned perfectly with known relay outposts from the early 1950s. But one coordinate stood out, an abandoned relay station near Vättern, marked with a single word, echo. When a small team of local historians visited the site, they found the remains of a radio shack, half swallowed by jungle. Inside, the equipment was still there, rusted, silent, and coated in decades of dust. But one thing hadn't decayed. A logbook, its pages yellowed yet legible, containing the words Transmission, Manila Node Alpha, Repeater 13.73 MHz, Status, Active. The final entry was dated August 15th, 1953, the very day the operation had supposedly been decommissioned. Then came the strangest discovery. A group of amateur radio operators, intrigued by the story, began tuning in to the same frequency listed in the log, 1373 MHz. To their astonishment, they picked up a faint, rhythmic pulse. Not static, not random. It repeated every 47 seconds, and buried in the pattern, when slowed and analyzed, was a voice. Faint, distorted. A woman speaking in English, then Tagalog, repeating coordinates. The last line was clear. Node compromised. Do not reply. The recording spread quickly through online radio communities, then to journalists, and finally to historians. The voice, analysts confirmed, was authentic, consistent with 1950s transmission quality. It wasn't an echo from space or a digital forgery. It was a signal bouncing from somewhere somehow across time. When researchers retraced the coordinates the voice mentioned, they led to a small island northwest of Palawan, a site once used as a classified communications hub under US supervision. Excavations uncovered remnants of transmission cables, concrete foundations, and what appeared to be a subterranean chamber, sealed, flooded, and filled with equipment still bearing US Navy markings. Among the recovered items were reels of magnetic tape labeled Project Reflection, Manila. Their contents, though degraded, revealed recordings of intercepted Soviet broadcasts. But interspersed among them were transmissions of a different kind, Philippine civilian radio chatter, monitored and logged without consent. The implications were explosive. Shadow Node hadn't only targeted Soviet communications, it had been monitoring the Philippines itself, its politicians, military officers, even journalists. The supposed alliance between Washington and Manila had, in truth, masked an intricate surveillance web, where local sovereignty was an illusion maintained by mutual need and silence. In late 2025, the Philippine government issued a formal statement demanding clarification from Washington. None came. Declassified US records acknowledged routine signal operations in the region, but denied any knowledge of civilian surveillance. Historians, however, traced funding for Shadow Node directly to the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, the same department linked to MKUltra and other covert psychological operations. For the families of those who once worked the radio towers, the revelation was bittersweet. Some had long suspected their loved ones were part of something larger than simple communications. One former operator, now in his 90s, agreed to an interview. "We were told it was about defense," he said, "that we were guarding freedom. But sometimes, freedom comes with static." The rediscovery of the Manila Transmission reignited debate over Cold War ethics in Southeast Asia. The blurred lines between ally and subject, protection and manipulation. For many Filipinos, it was a reminder of how their nation, still healing from Japanese occupation, became a chessboard for foreign powers. Today, the 13.73 MHz frequency still hums faintly. Whether it's a natural echo or an unclaimed transmission, no one can say. But those who listen closely claim to hear fragments of that same voice, the woman warning, "Node compromised. Do not reply." Perhaps it's just atmospheric bounce. Perhaps not. The past has a way of lingering in signals, carried by airwaves that never quite die. And as the modern world races toward ever deeper surveillance, the Manila Transmission stands as both artifact and omen, a reminder that history's quietest betrayals often travel not by paper or weapon, but by signal, fading, repeating, and waiting for someone, someday, to tune in again.